Welcome to your next great novel. This is your host, Phil Williams. Today I'm with my lovely co-host, Denise Williams, and we'll be discussing two nonfiction books that we've both read. I Can't Make This Up, Life Lessons by Kevin Hart, and The Crash Course by Chris Martenson. How are you doing, Denise?
I'm well and excited to talk about these books.
Great. I'd like to start with The Crash Course by Chris Martenson. The thesis of The Crash Course is the next 20 years will be completely unlike the last 20 years. The world is in economic crisis, and there are no easy fixes to our predicament. Unsustainable trends in the economy, energy, and the environment have finally caught up with us and are converging. The Crash Course presents our predicament and it illuminates the path ahead, so you can face the coming disruptions and thrive without fearing the future or retreating into denial. In this book, you will find solid facts and grounded reasoning presented in a calm, positive, nonpartisan manner. Our money system places impossible demands upon a finite world. Exponentially rising levels of debt, based on assumptions of future economic growth to fund repayment, will shudder to a halt and then reverse. Unfortunately, our financial system does not operate in reverse. The consequences of massive deleveraging will be severe. Oil is essential for economic growth. The reality of dwindling oil supplies is now internationally recognized, yet virtually no developed nations have a plan B. The economic risks to individuals, companies, and countries are varied and enormous. Best case, living standards will drop steadily worldwide. Worst case, systemic financial crises will toss the world into jarring chaos. This book is written for those who are motivated to learn about the root causes of our predicaments, protect themselves and their families, mitigate risks as much as possible, and control what effects they can. With challenge comes opportunity, and the Crash Course offers a positive vision for how to reshape our lives to be more balanced, resilient, and sustainable. So, Denise, did you like The Crash Course?
I did. With that said, though, finance is not my forte. I hate to admit this because I know money is important, but usually I tune out these discussions, typically out of boredom. That sounds terrible and immature, but it is true. However, this book enabled me to understand today's economic system and actually find what is being stated interesting and relevant, and that's saying a lot coming from someone who really doesn't have a whole lot of interest in this.
When Denise says she doesn't have a whole lot of interest in finance, I remember when we first started dating, she had a check register, and I don't remember why I was...
You mean the carbon copies that I had, the carbon copy checks?
Yes, the carbon copy checks. And so I ever forget what it was, and I was just... I think I was asking you, well, do you have a check register? And you handed me your check register, and it was just a bunch of carbon copy checks. And I was like, don't you balance your checkbook? And you were like, no, I just kind of look at them, and then I just say, well, it's close enough. Was that about right?
Yeah, that's about right. I believe I said, yeah, I don't do that.
Yeah, you don't do that. Right. So that's Denise's level of interest in finance. So yeah, this is probably more up my alley. But
I like to do a lot of rounding.
Right. For me, this is one of my all-time favorite nonfiction books. We've actually met the author, Chris Martenson, and his partner, Adam Taggart. They're both very, very good guys. The book was published in 2011, and it's interesting because a lot of the outcomes that Martenson talks about in the book, a lot of his predictions, a lot of them have not happened yet anyway. Not only have they not happened, but in a lot of ways the opposite has happened. So he's taken some heat over the years for essentially being dead wrong in his predictions. But unfortunately, I think he'll be proven right over the next decade, maybe over the next few years. I think the issue is more on the timing, which is impossible to predict something as far as the timing goes. But these trends that he was identifying in the Crash Course, they're all there, and nothing has changed since then. If anything, we've gone down the same path, and the financial crises that he's talking about, I think those things might end up being worse than had we made some changes to the financial system and made things more sustainable. But that wasn't going to happen for a number of reasons. But the main concept was an eye-opener for me. And that concept is that we live on a finite planet with finite resources, but we have an economic system that requires exponential growth to function. This juxtaposition is a major problem one that hasn't even been identified by most, I would say. Most leaders are still pushing the growth at all costs. In fact, I don't know a single leader who's saying, hey, we can't just grow our economy forever. Anything that just grows exponentially forever would be, or something that just grows continuously would be like a tumor, right? So if you're constantly growing something, eventually it's not sustainable. Martenson, he uses a lot of data to back up his arguments, and that's sort of where he came from. Is he was sort of a data analyst and a scientist, so he uses a lot of data to back up his arguments. And I've yet to find anything that I would classify as like, oh, that was an error or he was wrong there. But because the data is all there and it's all well sourced. He has received some backlash for his belief that peak oil and peak energy will cause a massive decline in the standard of living of Americans, and really most everyone in the first world for the most part. For people who don't know, peak oil is basically an observation of how oil fields produce and decline. Conventional oil wells, for example, produce very much like a bell curve. So once the oil field reaches the peak of the bell curve, it's essentially all downhill after that. So we can use So the geologists can use world oil field data to estimate when and how much oil will be produced. This can also be done with coal and natural gas. Throughout all of industrial history, we've always had more and more cheaper energy from one year to the next. With peak energy, it's the idea that we'll have to deal with less and or more expensive energy from one year to the next. The world economy tracks energy use perfectly. What happens to the world economy if the energy available is more expensive and less, especially when we have a debt-based monetary system that requires exponential growth? With the shale bonanza, so I don't know, probably most of the listeners aren't really aware of this, but there's been a shale oil just huge bonanza over the past decade where the United States has produced this massive amount of shale oil. And and about 10 years ago, it was thought by most geologists that we would just keep going down in oil production. Like we'd never start producing more oil. But we had this massive shale oil bonanza for the past 10 years where we've produced, I think we were producing somewhere around 5 to 6 million barrels of oil a day, and we've upped it all the way back to 10, which is a huge, I think we're more or less where we were at the peak in 1970. Where we were at our peak of oil production, and then we trended down from about 10 million barrels of oil a day all the way to, I think we've got down to 5 maybe, and then we trended back up with the shale oil, which is, nobody really saw this coming. But one of the things about the shale oil fields is they decline very rapidly. And so the technology became available and the interest rates were low enough for these companies to obtain all these properties and start drilling all this shale oil. And but it's not as profitable as a conventional oil field. So it requires certain chemicals and water, and it's just a lot more energy intensive to get this oil out of the ground than a conventional well. And the other problem is these shale oil fields decline very rapidly. For example, there's one particular oil field, which is one of the most famous, is called the Bakken shale oil fields. And in the Bakken fields, the wells there declined by 69% after the first year. So almost 70% of the oil that's going to come out of that well is done after year one. So that's much different than the conventional fields that play out over 50 to 80 years. And the shale drillers have already accessed the best wells. And what's happening now even is that they're drilling new wells, and the new wells are so close together that they're pulling oil from stuff that's already been drilled. So it's just a matter of time before this last shale oil bonanza sort of peters out, and then we're stuck with really trying to figure out a way to boost our energy production, and that's not going to be easy. Anyway, so it's definitely a problem that we haven't faced yet, but I think it is probably coming fairly soon. And one of the things that I've heard some geologists talk about with the shale oil, they called it a retirement party, which I think is an apt way to describe it. Is like, this isn't something that's like, oh, we're back in business and everything is business as usual and it's great and we're going to be driving our Hummers to Walmart from here to infinity. No, this is a retirement party. And one of the big problems I see is that because we've had this retirement party, and I don't know if you remembered in 2008 when oil prices were about $150 a barrel and you'd go to the pump, it was $5 a gallon. People were starting to change their behavior. They drove less.
Buying Priuses.
They were buying more fuel efficient cars, and they were conserving the energy. And then prices crashed, and oil got cheap, gas got cheap again, and people went right back to buying massive vehicles. And so the price was telling everybody, no problem here. We have more than enough. Just keep on doing what you're doing. But the problem is what we're doing is unsustainable, and it's just a matter of time. We're dealing with a non-renewable resource that's not going to last forever. Anyway, I'm actually working on a trilogy that takes place in 2050. In the crash course, Chris Martenson details some possible future scenarios, and like I said before, up until now, he's been proven very wrong about the price of commodities and the price of the stock market. But I think he might be proven correct in the future. So what do you think the future will be like? What do you think are some things that you see coming by, say, I don't know, let's say 2050, since I have the book coming at some point here soon?
Well, I see scarcity happening with the planet's resources, not only of oil that you described in such detail. And, one of the things with the shale oil really quick is that it does, it's great to have it. And there's actually a lot close to the area that we live. We have friends that have actually, families who've made money on it, and all that is great. But at the same time, there's also a lot of environmental damage with it. Water tables being ruined, kids getting, people getting cancer, things like that from, the water table being ruined and things like that.
Plus the trucks.
Right.
This is something nobody thinks about.
Yeah, nobody thought about that.
But there's so many trucks running in and out on these roads that they're actually destroying the roads, but they're not actually paying enough taxes to fix the roads. So
right.
That's been a problem for the residents.
And a lot of these places are very rural and remote, and these people don't have a whole lot of money, and the roads aren't usually well taken care of. So I see the scarcity happening with the oil, but also with a lot of other natural resources, such as like even bees. And as a teacher, I see education needing to change drastically to prepare society for jobs that don't exist yet, which is something that education has to do. So we need that, but also to have the mental maturity and strength to tackle massive change in a sustainable and healthy manner.
Yeah, that's hard to do, especially when I don't think we even have a map yet. Like I think the leaders of our society have no idea. Like, we're still going down the wrong path, in my opinion. Definitely the wrong path. I think you make a very good point with the environmental problems, with the pollinators and insects, but
just the loss of species and what's the species and what's that's going to do to the different life cycles, the food chain life cycles.
Absolutely.
So, what do you think will happen by 2050?
Well, I've done a ton of research, as you know, just because I'm working on a trilogy that's coincidentally entitled 2050. So I think we'll see a currency crisis, and I think we'll see a major economic crisis before 2050. I think self-driving vehicles are a lock. I think we'll have a lot of jobs lost to automation. Trucking is the number one job in America, and by 2050, I think the trucks will be automated. Nearly 100% automated. So you have all those jobs completely gone, disappeared. I think our government continues to be more and more invasive and oppressive. More rules for us to follow and more penalties when we break the rules. That's a pretty easy prediction to make. That's been happening since 1776, so we're not stopping on that. Also, more surveillance. I think facial recognition cameras are going to be more and more ubiquitous. I think we'll have designer babies, where parents will be able to manipulate traits to create an improved human, smarter, taller, disease-resistant, whatever. I think there will be a bigger gap between the rich and the poor. We'll have AI robotics and robot domestics in the home. But I don't think it's going to be the Jetsons. Normal people have this stuff. I think only the wealthy will be able to afford the robotics in the home. I think that it's just going to be too expensive for normal people to be able to afford this stuff. And I think, like you were saying about some of the environmental calamities coming, I think some of that stuff is really serious. Erosion of topsoil because of unsustainable farming practices. We already have that issue. That's going to get worse. Shortage of phosphorus. Further acidification of the oceans, which is already a major issue, and why we have so many jellyfish now. Continued insect and pollinator decline. Clean freshwater shortages around the globe. Most of the stuff is already happening, but I don't see us reversing any of this stuff. So I think it gets worse.
It's very frightening, and I hope you're wrong.
So do I.
So what's your rating for the crash course?
I'd give it a solid 5 stars. What about you?
As far as finance books would go, it's definitely 5 out of 5 stars. But overall books, I'd have to give it a 4.5. Sorry, Chris. And because finance is not really my thing, it does take me a little while to really get into it and fully understand everything. But that's just because of where my interest lies, not because of the research or how well it was written.
Great. The second book we're going to discuss is I Can't Make This Up, Life Lessons by Kevin Hart. Denise and I originally listened to this on our beach vacation. We were sitting there laughing the whole time. But can you give the listeners a little synopsis about Kevin Hart's book?
Sure. It begins in North Philadelphia. That's where he was born. And he was born in an accident, unwanted by his parents. His father was a drug addict who was in and out of jail. His brother was a crack dealer and a petty thief. And his mother was overwhelmingly strict, beating him with belts, frying pans, and even his own toys. The odds, in short, were stacked against our young hero. But Kevin Hart, like Ernest Hemingway, J.K. Rowling, and Chocolate Drop before him, was able to defy the odds and turn it around. He takes us on a journey through what his life was, what it is today, and how he overcame each challenge to become the man that he is today.
I really enjoyed this book. It's hysterical, but it also has a great message. Can you tell the listeners a little about Kevin Hart's message?
Sure. Basically, Kevin Hart states, you can't control the events that happen to you, but you can control your interpretation. He thinks of life as a story, and your interpretation writes the next chapter. So choose the scene that will serve you best. I think what makes Kevin so successful is his positivity, practicing gratitude, and his ability to see humor in almost any situation. And he alludes to different pieces of this in the book as well. When terrible things happen to Kevin, and a lot of terrible things really have, he feels hurt. But one amazing thing he does, and he does address this quite a few times in the book, that he does something he shoulder shrugs it. Meaning that I think he literally probably does shrug his shoulders, but meaning that he quickly moves on, making the right choices and avoiding the wrong. For example, his father would give him gifts, but they were always stolen, which is kind of funny in a way. His mom would not let him keep the gifts, saying they were hot. His mom told Kevin that to put all the stuff back in the bag and place on the front porch. She told his father it was so hot it was burning a hole in her front porch and that he better remove it. So even though Kevin was very disappointed, he quickly got over that and already was seeing the humor in what his mom was saying. Apparently, one time he and his brother really wanted a dog, and they were talking about a dog and really wanted a dog. So one day his dad shows up with a full-grown dog. Kevin said they were so happy, and within minutes they were playing with the dog on their bed, he and his brother. A short while later, a knock came on the door, and a couple said that Kevin's dad had stolen their dog. His dad denied it, saying the lady was crazy, didn't know what they were talking about. And the lady said, I had enough of this. And she called out, Cuckoo! And the dog came running down and bounding down the steps. Which, I mean, Kevin could choose to be super mad at his dad for everything that he's done, the lying and doing all this. But he chooses to, yes, it hurts, and he was disappointed. He addresses that, and he wholeheartedly feels those things. But he also is shoulder shrugged it and then sees the humor in it. It is funny, and it's very funny to hear him talk about it. Kevin also has a great growth mindset in that he's constantly learning from his mistakes, and he will persevere through just about any setback. He gives funny example after funny example of how he does this. Kevin is extremely hardworking, and sometimes people think that funny people are not hardworking, but he is, and most of them really are. They're very energetic. It's amazing how they spend their days. They usually work about 16 hours a day. He says he can keep to this demanding schedule because of the strict schedule his mom forced upon him. His mom did not want Kevin to go down the same roads as his father. Then his brother did eventually get his life on track, but to go down those same road. So her theory was, well, I'm just going to make sure he has something to do constantly. So she made him join the swim team, basketball, homework, anything where he as soon as he got up in the morning, he had to go somewhere. As soon as he was off school, he had somewhere to go until, she could pick him up from work, after her work. So, and he said that even though many times he hated this, that his life was so structured that many times she wouldn't let him do other things, like spend a lot of time with friends. He said this was what prepared him for today. He even talks about how he's on a movie set while he's, reading this book, and how he, gets up early, he works out, he does this, he goes to meetings. And it's just nonstop. And he said this really prepared him for how his life is today. And it says, even though some of the material is inappropriate for kids, because he does swear and there are some stories that have some sexual content in them, he does have such a fantastic message for today's kids. I would love it if he would make a kid-friendly version, though it might not be quite as funny. You told me that one time we talked about this book, that his career as a comedian is not unlike that of an author. Can you expand on that?
Being an author or a musician or a comedian or an actor, the one thing that these professions all have in common, in my opinion, is a very steep hierarchy. For example, 98% of authors do not make a living from their writing. Even more than that, even if you're in the top 2%, there's a huge difference between being on the top 2% versus the top 1%. And even if you're in the top 1%, someone in the top, say, 0.1% is in a completely different stratosphere. Most books that people read and music that people listen to, or comedians that people watch, they're from the tippy top of these hierarchy pyramids. And it is unbelievably hard to reach the top. I think it helps if you're talented and hardworking like Kevin Hart. He's a good model for what I need to be successful as an author.
It's something that you obviously have to have a passion for.
Yep.
That it's something that you just know in your heart that you want to do. You have to have the perfect storm. You have to have passion for it. You have to have a talent for it. And then you have to have these other things too. Kevin Hart is someone who practices gratitude. He's gracious for, what his father showed him.
He's working 16 hours a day.
Right. I don't know. That's what it seems like. He didn't actually come out and say that in the book,
he's
but I'm sure he is. So he takes all those things and he's grateful for what the things that it gave him, whether it be humor. And that's a really tough pill for a lot of people to swallow, is to take some of these difficult things that happen to you and turn it into something that can be really positive. And I can relate with when certain things happen with me, I will get really upset, and I cannot shoulder shrug it at this point like he can. I wish I could, but after a while I'll start making jokes out of it too. And it does make things a lot better. It does make you heal. For me anyway, heal a lot more quickly. And I think that his perfect storm has made him so successful. I think I'd even on Amazon, I think that he says something like last year he overall gross almost like 3.8 billion or something like that. I mean, it's a crazy amount of money with all his sales and everything that he's done.
Movies and all that stuff.
All the movies.
Well, here's the other thing, how his job is similar to mine. First of all, my audiobooks are competing with his audiobook.
Right.
And the comedians of the world, like Kevin Hart, is competing against all the best comedians in the world, basically in the English-speaking world. Right. And my books are competing against all the best authors in the English-speaking world. So I'm competing with Stephen King and everybody else. For example, if I started a landscaping company around here, I'd be competing with the 100 other landscape companies. It's a little bit different than competing against the million-plus authors in the world. So, and the other thing is, if I was competing with the 100 landscape companies, if I was in the top 50%, I'd probably be making a living.
Right.
like of the ones that are in business. That pyramid is much wider and easier to get to the top. Anyway.
And as you said, if you'd have known all this way back in the day, you don't know if you'd have tackled it.
I know. I don't think I don't know if I would have, because it seems impossible. If you really think about it, it seems like this is crazy and impossible. And I'm actually in the top. Last I looked at my author rank, and the author rank on Amazon isn't exactly perfect. Like I don't fully understand the metrics, but according to author rank, I was around 6,000. And I think that there's roughly 1 million authors on Amazon. So if I'm at 6,000, that's 0.6%. So I'm under the 1% in authors. You know, if I could hold 6,000, I can't. I mean, I just had some good marketing at the time. I'm usually averaging around somewhere between 10 to 15,000. At 6,000, I can make not a good living, but a decent living as an author. But at 10 to 15,000, I'm making enough that I'm making about what somebody who works full time at Walmart makes. So, and that's in the top. So at 10 to 15,000, I'm in the top 1 to 1.5% of authors on Amazon, and I'm still making not a tremendous amount of money at all. I mean, I'm really struggling. Like if I didn't have your salary and I didn't have money from selling my business a long time ago, I would be really poor. I mean, I'd be struggling.
Artist.
Yeah, I'd be a starving artist. Exactly. So it's interesting how it all works.
Right. And I think, though, that the message is so strong, even if this is something that is not your goal, just to work really hard in the way to handle difficult situations, I think is amazing. And the fact that he's so popular and he does it with so much humor is just really great. And I just think he has the potential here also to make a huge difference for people's lives, and especially young people. And like I said, I think it would be great if even kids, because a lot of kids think he's funny, would hear some of this. And I think that would really make them look at things a little differently.
Absolutely. So what's your rate? I know what your rating is going to be, so let's go ahead and say.
It's a 5 out of 5. I felt this was extremely entertaining. It's a wonderful message, and he narrates the audio book, so it's worth a listen. Not only did Phil and I listen to it on the way to the beach, but then because we had listened to a book prior to it, and I think the last couple of hours we listened to it, and then we thought it was so funny that we actually took it on the beach with us, and we put one earbud in one ear and Phil's ear and one in mine, and we were sitting there just like giggling on the beach as we listened to the rest of the book. It was really funny. I would highly recommend it. His narration of it is hysterical.
Great. So that's it for today. Thank you for listening to another episode of your next great novel. Be sure to subscribe. You can find the podcast at philwbooks.com and on iTunes, Stitcher, or TuneIn.